All right, so get this today. We're going deep into a topic most people just whisper about BDSM, but specifically from a woman's perspective.
Okay.
And even more interesting, our source material is this guidebook, Submission 101, but it's written by a man.
Really?
Yeah, a man named Christopher Dominus.
Okay, now that's interesting. A man writing a guide for women on submission.
It got my attention, that's for sure.
Okay.
So anyway, in this deep dive, we're going to try to figure out what this book actually reveals about submission in the BDSM world. You know, like what are the myths, what's real, and the psychology of it all.
Yeah, that's a big one. There's so much to unpack there. You know, separate the Hollywood version of BDSM from what it's really like for people who actually practice it. And Dominus really spends a lot of time on that, debunking those misconceptions right up front.
Well, that's important.
It is.
So where does he even start?
Well, he lays out the basics of BDSM, like what it stands for.
Right, BDSM.
Which even if you think, you know, it's good to be reminded about like bondage and discipline, domination and submission and sadism and masochism.
Got it.
But what he really wants to emphasize is that those things don't exist in a vacuum. They all come back to these three core pillars: consent, communication, and mutual desire between partners.
So it's not about one person forcing anything on another. It's like a collaboration.
Exactly. It's about people coming together, talking about what they want and what they don't want, and then creating something together.
Creating experience.
Yeah. And he's really adamant about getting rid of these harmful myths that say BDSM is just about rough sex or that it's inherently dangerous. He says, actually, when practiced responsibly, it can be this pathway to self-discovery.
The self-discovery, really?
A way to release tension and even a path to happiness, but a unique kind of happiness. He calls it controlled surrender.
Okay, I gotta admit, that has me intrigued. Controlled surrender. It seems kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? Like it flips the script on how we usually think about power. One of his main arguments is that submission doesn't equal weakness at all. He says it's a conscious and courageous act of choosing to trust and letting go of control.
So wait, you're saying letting go can be empowering?
That's exactly what he's saying. But the big thing is it has to be on your own terms. You set the framework.
Okay, so help me understand this better. How can giving up control be empowering?
Well, think about it this way. Have you ever let someone else take charge and actually enjoyed it?
I mean, I guess so. Like when my partner plans a surprise date, I kind of like not knowing where we're going. The mystery is fun.
Exactly. And Dominus gives examples like that in the book, letting your partner pick your outfit or following directions during a game. It's about letting go, but within a framework that you've agreed to.
And he's saying that leads to empowerment.
Yeah. A feeling of liberation.
Huh. Interesting. So it's not about giving up all control. It's more like choosing which control you give up.
You got it. And what's really fascinating is how he connects this back to how we live today. You know, there's all this pressure to be in control all the time.
Oh, totally.
Like we have to manage everything in our lives. Careers, relationships, everything. So in a way, choosing to submit in a BDSM context can be almost like a rebellion against all that pressure to constantly be in control.
So it's a way to reclaim a different kind of agency.
Right. It's like pushing back against that always-on mentality and instead choosing to let go and see what happens.
Wow. I'm already seeing submission in a whole new light. Not weak at all. More like a conscious choice. A way to experience something different, something freeing. But what about the other side of that coin? What about the dominant?
Yes, the dominant. This is where things can get a little intimidating for some people. But Dominus really makes it clear that in a days relationship, it's not about one person having all the power and the other being completely powerless.
Okay, so it's not like a dictatorship.
Not at all. He says it's more of a collaboration built on trust and negotiation.
So the submissive has a say.
Absolutely. The submissive sets boundaries and essentially gives the dominant permission to lead within those boundaries.
So more like a dance than a dictatorship.
I like that analogy. Yeah, like a dance, where both partners have a role to play and they're constantly communicating and adjusting to each other.
And that all comes back to trust.
It all comes back to trust and understanding both partners working together to create something special.
To create that shared experience.
Yeah. And Dominus has this great analogy in the book. He compares the submissive to someone setting the destination and conditions for a voyage.
Okay.
And the dominant is like the captain who's entrusted to steer the ship safely.
I love that. It really shows how important consent is.
Consent is everything. And Dominus is super clear about that. He actually says, without consent, it's not BDSM, it's abuse. And he goes on to explain that consent isn't just a one-time thing.
So it's not like you say yes once and that's it.
Nope. It has to be ongoing, specific, and reversible at any time.
That makes sense. Like if you've ever felt pressured to do something you didn't want to do, you know how important that kind of ongoing consent is?
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that Dominus goes beyond just saying consent is important. He dives into the different types of submissives.
Different types.
Yeah, he's acknowledging that everyone experiences submission differently. He breaks them down into categories like sensual discipline, service-oriented, and the playful brat. But he also makes it clear that these are just broad categories.
So there's a lot of nuance.
A lot of nuance and overlap.
Yeah. And that's one of the key takeaways from this part of the book. Submission is a very personal and nuanced experience. There's no right or wrong way to be submissive.
So it's about figuring out what works for you.
Exactly. It's about exploring your desires, your boundaries, and what makes you feel good within a BDSM context.
I'm already learning so much, but I'm curious to dig even deeper into the psychology of it all. Like, why would someone want to give up control in the first place? What are the benefits of submission?
Oh, those are the million-dollar questions.
Let's try to answer them in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back. You know, before we get into the psychology of it all, I keep thinking about that idea you mentioned that choosing submission can be a form of rebellion.
Oh, yeah.
In a world that tells us we have to be in control all the time.
Well, it's true. We're constantly bombarded with messages about being on and in control.
Right. It's like society expects us to manage every single aspect of our lives.
Careers, relationships, finances, even our emotion.
It can be exhausting. And so Dominus argues that choosing to submit, even within the specific dynamic, can be like a breath of fresh air.
I get that. Sometimes I just want someone to tell me what to do, you know?
Exactly. It's like giving yourself permission to step off that treadmill of constant decision-making and just be present.
To trust someone else to make those decisions.
At least within a certain context, right?
Yeah. And you were saying that the Dominus calls this a form of reclaiming agency?
He does. He says it's a different kind of agency, one that's rooted in consciously choosing to let go of control rather than constantly fighting for it.
So it's not about giving up power altogether. It's about choosing where and how to direct it.
Exactly. And that's a perspective on power that I think a lot of women can relate to, especially in today's world.
I'm starting to see that. But I have to ask, even with all this talk about consent and negotiation, isn't there a risk that someone might use BDSM to manipulate a submissive partner?
That's a really important question. And it's something Dominus addresses directly. He's very clear that without true, enthusiastic, and ongoing consent, it's not BDSM, it's abuse. And he offers a lot of practical advice on how to set boundaries in a D's relationship.
Like what kind of advice?
Well, he emphasizes open communication.
Yeah.
And setting clear limits from the very beginning. He even suggests specific questions to ask a potential dominant.
Oh, really? Like what?
Things like their experience with BDSM, how they handle boundaries, what they value most in a D's relationship. It's about gathering information and making sure you're both on the same page.
So you're not just jumping into anything blindly.
Nope. It's more like an interview process. You're getting to know the person. And Dominus also talks about soft and hard limits. Have you ever heard of those?
I'm not sure. Explain it.
So a soft limit is something you might be a little uncomfortable with, but willing to explore under the right circumstances. Like maybe you're not sure about being blindfolded, but you're open to trying it with a trusted partner in a safe environment.
So it's like testing the waters.
Exactly. But a hard limit is non-negotiable. It's something you absolutely will not do, and your partner needs to respect that completely.
So how do you communicate those hard limits, especially when things are getting intense?
That's where safe words come in. Dominus is a big advocate for using safe words, like a simple system, like a traffic light. Green means everything's okay. Yellow means slow down, and red means stop immediately.
Makes sense.
He stresses that using safe words isn't a sign of weakness. It's a crucial tool for staying safe and making sure everyone's consenting throughout the experience.
It's like having an emergency brake. You can always pull it if you need to.
Exactly. And it reinforces the idea that even in a submissive role, you still have agency. You still have control.
All this talk about safe words makes me think about how important trust is in BDSM.
Oh, absolutely. Trust is paramount. And Dominus spends a lot of time talking about how to build and maintain trust in a D's relationship.
I bet that's not easy.
It takes time and effort. He emphasizes open communication, honesty, mutual respect, and he encourages potential submissives to really get to know their potential dominant person. Don't rush into anything.
It sounds like building a healthy BDSM relationship is a journey.
It is. It's a process. And even when you have that strong foundation of trust, it's something you have to keep nurturing.
It makes me realize that BDSM is so much more complex than I initially thought. It's not just about whips and chains. It's about communication, trust, pushing boundaries, but in a safe and consensual way.
I agree. And Dominus makes it clear that there's a lot of diversity in the BDSM community. Remember those different submissive types we talked about? What works for one person might not work for another. And it's so important to be aware of your own needs and desires and boundaries.
Which brings us back to that question of why someone might choose to give up control in the first place. We've talked about escaping the pressures of modern life. But are there other reasons?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where Dominus gets into the really interesting psychological aspects of submission.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Submission 101. And honestly, what I'm still stuck on is this whole idea of wanting to give up control. Like, what's the psychology behind that?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
And Dominus gets into some really interesting psychological motivations behind submission. Things that go beyond just escaping everyday life.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Hit me with those deeper motivations.
Well, one of the most interesting things he points out is that giving up control can actually be a way to relieve stress.
Really? How so?
Think about it. In our daily lives, we're constantly bombarded with decisions, big and small.
I know. What to eat, what to wear, which deadlines to tackle. It's never ending.
It's exhausting. Right.
Totally.
And that's where the appeal of submission comes in. It's about letting go of that mental burden and trusting someone else to make those decisions.
You mean like taking a mental vacation?
Exactly. Dominus describes it as a way to step off that hamster wheel of decision-making and just be in the moment.
It reminds me of when I travel. When I don't have to worry about work or responsibilities, and I could just let someone else handle the logistics.
That's a perfect example. And it brings up another key psychological benefit that Dominus talks about, the power of vulnerability.
Vulnerability, how does that fit in?
Well, submission by its very nature requires a certain level of vulnerability. You're trusting someone else with your well-being, allowing them to lead you to push your boundaries, to see you in a way you might not even show yourself.
That sounds a little scary, but also kind of exciting.
It's both, isn't it? It's a paradox.
Yeah.
And Dominus argues that for a lot of women, this act of surrendering control, of allowing themselves to be vulnerable, can be incredibly empowering.
So it's about owning your desires.
Yes. Even the ones that society might consider taboo. It's like saying, this is me, this is what I want, and I'm not ashamed of it.
I can see how that could be powerful, especially for women who are often told to suppress their desires.
It's about reclaiming your sexuality and your agency. But, I'm sure there are still plenty of people who struggle with the stigma surrounding BDSM. It's not exactly mainstream, is it?
Definitely not. And I'd imagine that can be really tough for people who are interested in exploring it.
Absolutely. And Dominus acknowledges that he doesn't shy away from the fear and the shame that many women experience when they first start exploring BDSM. He talks about all the negative stereotypes, the misconceptions, the pressure to conform.
So how does he suggest overcoming that stigma?
Education is a big one. He encourages readers to seek out accurate information about BDSM, to learn about consent and safety, and to challenge those harmful stereotypes.
This is about separating fact from fiction.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of finding your community, connecting with other people who share your interests.
I bet that's huge, to know you're not alone.
It is. It's about finding support and validation and guidance from people who understand. But he also reminds readers that self-compassion is crucial.
Self-compassion.
Yeah, it's about accepting yourself. Even the parts that you might feel ashamed of or uncomfortable with. It's about recognizing that your desires are valid no matter what anyone else says.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And in the end, it sounds like Dominus's book is really about empowerment.
It is. He wants women to know that this is their journey, their choice. It's about setting their own boundaries, exploring at their own pace, and creating a BDSM experience that's right for them.
It's about owning your choices and your sexuality.
And recognizing that knowledge is power. The more you understand about BDSM, about yourself, and about these dynamics of power and control, the better equipped you'll be to make those choices.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left feeling like we've just scratched the surface of a really fascinating world.
We have, and I think what's so important about Dominus's book is that it encourages us to approach this topic with curiosity and open-mindedness, to question our assumptions.
Because even if we don't personally identify with BDSM, learning about these dynamics of power, control, and surrender can teach us so much about ourselves and our relationships.
It's about breaking down those walls of judgment and stigma and having open, honest conversations about desire and consent and the different ways we experience pleasure and connection.
So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep challenging those preconceived notions.
And most importantly, be true to yourself. Honor your desires and make choices that feel empowering and authentic to you.
That's great advice. And on that note, that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.